Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to take a moment again to welcome all of you. Thank you so much for um, carving out some time today for this really important talk that we're having with our very special guest, Dr. Siobhan O'Neill. I'm Jennifer Ciarimboli. I'm the founder and CEO of Studio B, and I'm just thrilled that we're here together today having this conversation. So I just want to take a moment to introduce Dr. O'Neill. Dr. Siobhan O'Neill is a part-time assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and co-founder of Mindframe Consulting. She is a graduate of Harvard Medical School's residency in psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, McLean Hospital, where she served as chief resident. She completed advanced training in psychoanalytical psychotherapy, group psychotherapy, spiritual psychology, and psychosynthesis. Dr. O'Neill is currently a student of the Insight Yoga Institute and a longtime meditation practitioner in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. Dr. O'Neill has a clinical practice and consults to major malpractice insurers in the Boston area and New England. Since 2008, she has been facilitating peer resource and support groups for doctors and nurses. She teaches nationwide on navigating the aftermath of adverse events and litigation, and on cultivating humanity and self-care in the practice of medicine. She lives in the Boston area with her husband, a fellow practitioner, and her 3 sons, whom she considers her most important teachers. Welcome, Dr. O'Neill. It's so good to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Sarah Jane, for facilitating this invitation. And thank you for the important work that you're doing, Jen, you and your organization at Studio B, in the goal of bringing mindfulness into corporations and into many other places in our country. It's such important work now more than ever before. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Friends for being here. I see so many friendly faces, so it's really nice. Thank you, all of my friends, for being here.
Yes, it's so nice to see everyone come together for you today. And you know, I can't help but reflect on the conversation we had earlier this week in preparing for today's meeting, and this understanding that all the work that you're doing right now today, this important work, has really been a lifelong practice, this lifelong curiosity, this lifelong dedication to really being with the mind, with the body in a profound way. You mentioned that movement in particular was very important to you at a young age. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, yes. Think movement as well as spiritual practice has been with me my entire life. I mean, movement starting with dance, but also yoga. I started yoga at a young age. But really spiritual practice and knowing that the inner life and the life of the mind were of central importance. You know, my earliest teachers there were really my parents. They both spent significant amounts of time in religious communities before they eventually left and then met each other and married to have a family. And they always maintained that as a central focus in their lives and in our family life. So they were my earliest models and examples of the notion that the spiritual life and the life of the mind are of central importance. And so that has always been with me. And yes, finding meaning and importance in dance and yoga started very early for me. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and this attending to the mind, Siobhan, how did this begin? When did it really formulate into a practice?
Well, I would say, again, like earliest memories of that would be praying the rosary with my mother. You know, that was a young practice, sort of a recitation that you did as a ritual, and even yeah, a recitation that we did as a group, as a family, that's a practice. And then other practices from there. But and different kinds of meditation. I started even in high school. And I didn't do more mindfulness type practices that I do now until later in my life, until I met my husband, and we started to practice in the more Buddhist tradition, in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, when we started to do family retreats with the Thich Nhat Hanh's Order of Interbeing, when they would come and do their retreats here in the Boston area every couple of years.
Yes.
That was about 12 or 13 years ago now. Yeah.
And you've mentioned him as being one of your most influential teachers. And, just kind of reflecting back, obviously you study the minds. There's this, you're a doctor uh, of the minds of psychiatry. And we talked a little about how this, the practice of psychiatry and the practice of meditation um, is really an art, you know, this art of psychiatry or psychiatry of an art. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, I think as you and I were speaking, medicine, all of medicine is really an art, more than many of us might like to wish. That there is less certainty and less known or knowable than we might often like to wish. But that particularly is apparent in psychiatry, where we arrive at what we come to understand about a patient that we're working with through a very iterative process. It's an iterative relational process that we engage in with a patient, and um, we can't really absolutely know anything. Actually, we can only discover and then refine by continuing in a process. And then it's a very relational process. And I think of it more and more as very similar to what I engage in my own mindfulness practice, which is it's a similar iterative and relational process I engage in with myself. I try to be with myself and open to myself in this iterative relational way. I try to be with what is arising within myself.
Mhm.
Similarly, when I am with a patient, I am striving to be with what is arising now here. This is more I'm thinking about in the psychotherapeutic process, like being with what is arising between the two of us right now in this moment, and being curious about it.
Mhm.
Bringing an openness, a curiosity, and a non-judgmental stance is very similar, I think. But more broadly, thinking of psychiatry as a practice, what you and I were also speaking about, that even diagnostically, we have these diagnoses in psychiatry, and we do have some structures in terms of how do we come to diagnoses, and we think about them, but they're not so clear. We always must remain open to refining and learning more, and in that sense is very much an art. And there is not this certainty we might wish for. So maintaining this uh, openness to possibilities, and this non-limited view or non-limiting view, is what we were speaking about as the art side of it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful because, of course, any type of medical diagnosis could be really overwhelming. And so when your patients, I would imagine when they come to see you, they're looking for these concrete answers. And in my experience, it's just not always possible. And so in meditation, in mindfulness meditation in particular, we talk a lot about this relationship or developing a relationship with impermanence, this idea of uh, change and establishing this capacity to be with change in an open and curious way. And we were relating a lot about how that parallels the work that you're doing. And of course, you mentioned that, you know, it's not just in psychiatry. It's in all work with disease and illness and looking for that magic pill, right? Which may never be. So this openness is really beautiful. This ability to stay open to the possibilities, because I think, of course, impermanence sometimes could feel overwhelming,
Mm. Yes, of course. It can. It sure can.
right?
Yeah. Mm.
But it could also mean that the difficulties, and I think this is obviously very relatable right now with the pandemic, and the difficulties that we're facing together in relationship to the COVID-19 crisis, that this too will change.
Yes. Yes. So it can offer hope as well. Yes.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so this non-limiting view, what does it mean? How would you define or describe what what it means to heal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, one can think about that in many ways. If we think of healing in the body, there are, one could think about repair, like the body repairs itself, our tissues repair themselves. It's a natural innate capacity of the body to do that. So that's one way of thinking about it. And I think more in terms of in the domain I work in psychiatry, I think about it as maybe more of a process of integration. We have difficulties in life or loss or um, relational ruptures, and healing is that process of how do we face those, walk through those, and then integrate those into a new sense of who we are as individuals, who we are as people in relationship to others. How do we integrate them in our lives? And so perhaps I might think about it as how do we integrate? How do we continue to integrate new experience, even unwanted, unwelcome, difficult, painful experience? How do we first bear it?
Mm-hmm.
How do we first bear it? How do we first be with it? And then how do we put it in perspective and integrate it in our lives? What comes to mind is of course, a phrase from a loving kindness meditation, which is, may I be at peace with whatever arises. That practice of being at peace with whatever arises, which is of course so much harder to do at times than others, but that is part of healing, like growing a capacity to be with whatever arises, learning to utilize whatever resources, build and utilize the resources needed to be with whatever arises. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The I'm reflecting on, you know, the definition of mindfulness, really, moment to moment awareness, the truth of what's happening in this moment, uh, without turning away,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
and whatever it is, like what's here right now, what's true right now, how is my body right now in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a quote by Dan Siegel, and I know that you admire a lot of his work, and
I
um,
do. I
and
do.
and it says, between the two, harmony emerges from integration. Chaos
Mm-hmm.
and rigidity arise when integration is blocked.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, his work is really profound. He's a doctor of psychiatry, correct?
He
From
is. Yes, yes, he is. Well, he's a doctor of psychiatry, and he's also just a real visionary thinker. And he founded the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And I think
Mhm.
what's just incredible about his work is that and it's not just his work, but he's really convened scientists from many, many disciplines to integrate. I mean, he's he's such an integrator, really, and he's really defined this field called interpersonal neurobiology, which has attempted to define what is the mind, and how do we study the mind. And he's had a profound influence on how are we thinking about the mind and how are we studying it. And I think he's a great speaker. He has a lot of talks out there that are available and very accessible to even to the general public. And his definition of the mind is beautiful. It's beautiful, and I think it's so useful because it captures so much of what we're talking about, and it actually it sums up what we're wanting to get at today, which is well, here his definition is that it's an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. That's his definition of the mind. It's unlike any other definition that anyone has ever thought of before. He came up with it as a consensus definition from many, many scientists. And I think what's important about it is it's a process,
Mhm.
and it's not located in us, according to his definition. It's relational, and it's not located in our brains. It doesn't emanate from the brain, it's embodied.
Mhm.
So it gets to a lot of what we're after today, which is it's embodied and it's relational. And from there he gets to, therefore our notion that our mind is just us, or our mind is simply us, is so off base that we our mind is as much our relationships as anything else. I mean, he will even go so far as to say that definition of mind is absolutely embodies the Buddhist notion that there can be no separate self,
Mhm.
which is really
Yeah,
a huge,
amazing.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of his. I'm a huge
Yeah,
fan of his.
his
Yeah,
wheel
yeah,
of awareness is his main. I don't know if it's his main practice, but that's what I know him for, the wheel of
yeah,
awareness, and awareness
yeah.
practices.
It's
And
a great practice. Yeah.
yeah, and just making a more advanced practice very accessible, to even a beginner, into
Yes.
mindfulness
Yes.
meditation.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
What has been the most fascinating intersection between your professional work and your experiences in traditional Buddhist practices in your long time practice? What excites you right now? There's so much science, the science of mindfulness. We have 20 years
Hmm.
of studies, over 7,000 studies on the efficacy of mindfulness. What
Yeah.
what turns you on there? What excites you?
I think right now, probably what's most exciting to me in my work is the work I do with healthcare professionals in helping them navigate work-related stressors, and the enormity and gravity of the difficulty that they face on the job day in and day out. And that's of course only gotten more extreme and extraordinary with the onset of the pandemic. But I think that's the most exciting and challenging because I've and it's coincided with a real for me a real intensifying of my training and practice yin yoga studies and like more formal training in yin yoga studies and basic yoga teacher training with Sarah Jane. My teacher was here, Sarah Jane. So so it's no coincidence, I'm sure, that those two are together, but it's also the case that since the beginning of the pandemic, I am just doing more of this work because there's more need and more call for it, that there is such profound need. Healthcare professionals face so much stress on the job, and they paradoxically, the culture in healthcare, has supported and called for healthcare professionals largely to neglect their own well-being. It's this really remarkable paradox that's
Almost,
in some
systemic, it's
yeah, yes, and that's starting to change and shift in some places, and there's definitely this awareness that there's a need for that to change, but I think there isn't yet. It's not there yet. The awareness is growing. The awareness is growing that the need is there. There's a lot known about what can be done and what training works and what's useful, but it's still really endemic in the culture that healthcare professionals neglect their own well-being, or it's still tacitly expected that you'll just do, and what goes first is your own. It's still like expected that you might not have time to pee, sleep, or eat.
right.
That you might just work for 12 hours without peeing or eating. Like that's just normal in many parts of the healthcare culture, which is noteworthy. So so um, so there's a huge need for that to shift. But what's exciting to me is there's so much that can be taught. There's so much that can be taught because there's so much that's known about what skills are teachable and immediately useful and immediately utilizable for healthcare professionals to build resilience that they can use on the job, that they can bring to their jobs for them to feel better and do better in the workplace. So I most experience this in the peer resource groups that I lead and co-lead for healthcare professionals who are in litigation, who are in the aftermath of adverse events, and more recently who are working on the front lines in COVID and wanting a place to talk about those stressors and what that's like for them. Yeah, that's exciting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Your company is called Mindframe Consulting, and you mentioned on the website that the increase in resilience and this capacity and skill in meeting the range of challenges in medicine today. How has COVID impacted your work in the last 9 months? How has your work changed?
Yeah, well, like the work many people are doing, my work is all on video screen now. So that's because it's possible for me to do most of my work that way. I am doing almost all of it that way. So that's the most significant and obvious change. The good news, I still can work and I can do my work that way. But it's also shifted my work more toward the consulting with Mindframe. I'm doing more of that than patient care at the moment because there is such a need for that.
I would
Yeah. And I have done some work going into hospitals to do groups for hospitalists. So those are people who take care of patients in the hospital, to hold some groups for them in the hospital setting, some support groups for those kinds of professionals. And that's been really gratifying and interesting to do. So, but the main impact has been that I'm on a video screen, and I've lost that contact to colleagues, running into colleagues in the hospital where I teach residents. I'm teaching them on the screen, and that's been a real loss, that opportunity to meet colleagues and see colleagues and meet with people. That's been a real loss. But otherwise, I think what's been interesting is uh, the the peer resource groups that we do we're having an experience where people from all over the country are attending them now. We used to do some on a teleconference format anyway, but not as many. And so that's been very interesting to hear about the various experiences people are having across the country with the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. How are frontline workers obviously are on top of mind, I think, for most of us right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, with many
Yeah.
of us, and we just went into another stay-at-home order where we're living. Well, actually, it's not, I guess it's really not a stay-at-home order, but
Mm-hmm.
shut down
Mm-hmm.
restaurants and gyms and
Mm, mm.
um, re-
Yeah.
some retail, a lot of
Yeah.
restrictions.
Yeah.
Still, that you know, our frontline workers, even though these restrictions are going in place, they have to show up for work, and they're
Yeah.
showing up, and they're under incredible, surreal conditions. How are they doing?
Yeah, it's been really a privilege to work with them and listen to them and hear from them about how they're doing. And I think initially I anticipated that many of them would talk about how hard work is, um, and that would be the focus of what they're struggling with. But interestingly, many of them have said, yeah, work is hard, but work is always hard. And I feel like I'm doing my job. I know what to do. The challenge at work has been, particularly early in the pandemic, that the what we knew about it was changing every day. The guidelines were changing every day. We had to have a briefing every morning to say, okay, what's the policy today? What's the policy about how we handle this today? What's the status of availability of PPE today? So that the unknown and the unknowable and the fluctuations were a source of real stress. So that was early on, mostly like the on the job stress.
Right.
But many of them said, but once that got sorted out, going to work is the easy part. I know what to do. I know what to expect. Work has always been hard. This is not that it's so much harder. I wear the gear I know I need to wear. I know how to do it. I know how to keep myself safe. My coworkers know how to keep themselves safe. Many of them have said, surprisingly, I feel less safe out of the hospital than I do in the hospital. Because out of the hospital, people aren't wearing their masks. They're not doing what they need to do. The general public is not doing what they need to do to stop this pandemic. I lost my childcare at home. So now we have no one to support us and take care of my kids at home. So I don't know how I'm going to be able to keep going to work because I have no childcare and my family members aren't comfortable coming in my house because I work in a hospital. And my wife is a doctor and she has to cut down her hours because we have no childcare. And our friends won't see us because we're both doctors and they don't want to come near us. And like these are the stressors.
Wow.
These are the stressors. So it's not just that I work in a hospital and that's stressful. And then my home life is not predictable. I have no childcare. And then my social supports have broken down because family members won't watch my kids, understandably, right? Understandably. And friends won't come, understandably. And then maybe they've had their own loved ones who are sick, and maybe their own loved ones who have died in the, so there are these layers and layers that not only they're managing this in the hospital, but we are all affected, not only in our jobs, but then on multiple personal levels and interpersonal levels that it's incredible, the layers of it, right? So they're managing at work, and many of them say work is hard. It's very hard, and it's the outside of work part that's actually more stressful than the at work part. and many of them,
I'm
many
really,
of them.
yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
So right, I was also gonna say many of them just talk about their feelings about the fact that the general public, that some people in the general public are having a difficult time complying with, safety precautions. That feels really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just such an incredible time. My mother's a nurse. She's been a nurse for 50 years.
Oh my goodness.
She's still working.
She's still working. Wow.
Yeah, she's
Yeah.
70. And she and I
Wow.
were talking about this. We were talking about
Yeah.
the frontline
Yeah.
workers, and she said, she was a single mom, and she said, I know that there are nurses out there that are single parents. I know there are doctors out there that are single parents, and I can't imagine. So she already kind of,
Yeah.
she was imagining
Yeah.
the difficulty that you
Yeah.
just described, which
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
how am I going to do this? And also show up and do my work, and
Yeah.
which I'm so committed to.
Yeah.
And so it's really, and what we also talked about is the lack of self-care in the medical
Yes.
profession.
Yes. Yes.
How do we convince, our frontline workers, how do we convince them to take care of themselves right now?
Yes. And Jen, you can see where when we've just said all we've just said, I've
Yeah.
got this going on at work, and then I've got the kids, and I've got no childcare, and you want me to get on Zoom and do a mindfulness class? Are you
Right.
out of your mind? Right.
Right.
Or you want me to get on a Zoom and go to this peer support group? Are you kidding me? Like, are you kidding me? Like, how do I? It's,
Right.
of
Right.
course, that's how it feels, right? So I think it's really hard because um, we know that these practices are helpful and useful, and we know that they work, and we know that there are skills that when practiced and used can really help build these inner resources, right? So I
Yeah.
think that we've got to get very creative in adapting them to on the job. They can be taught and mobilized and utilized on the job in that context where people aren't being asked, or they don't feel like they're being asked to after work, when
Right.
all they need to do is see their kids, eat and rest and recuperate. They're not then being asked to go do this on their resting time or on their own time, that they need something that's offered in the context of work that becomes part of work, that it's inherent, right? So that it's part of it, not this separate thing on the side that you're supposed to somehow figure out how to get for yourself. That's crucial. There's actually studies about this in the literature on burnout in the medical literature, that a few things are critically important if they're going to work. If interventions are going to work, there are some qualities that must be present. One is that they're coming from leadership and supported by leadership. The other is that they're built into the work context. Like, there's protected time or work time that is devoted to those activities, not like you're supposed to go do this on your own time. Yeah.
Right.
And that they're doable in the context of work. So that's critically important. And there are some mindfulness practices that are developed and available to be utilized in that way. One of them is one that I had mentioned to you about, the Honor Project. Do you want to talk about that
Yeah, I
now
would love
already?
to.
Yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
was developed by Rosemary Rossi at UCSF.
That's right. So that's a colleague and friend of mine. She works at the Neuro-Oncology Center at UCSF. So it's a brain tumor clinical center. And she's a social worker who supports caregivers of brain tumor patients, but she also supports the staff, so the staff who take care of those patients. And she developed this program some years ago, and it's essentially a ritual. It's a team-based intervention. It's a ritual, and the purpose of it is to give the team a structure and a place to give voice to their grief, to process their grief. Most of their patients in the brain tumor center do eventually die of their brain tumors, so they have a very high patient mortality rate, and that takes a real toll on the caregivers and on the medical staff. So she developed this ritual, and once a month they get together and they do this together. And it doesn't take so much time, but it's a structure that gives a time and a place to give voice to their grief, and honor the patients who have died in the past month. So she's described this in an abstract that she published, and it's beautiful. They've been doing it for years, and what she described to me recently was, and also, so early in the pandemic, she and I consulted with the hospital in the Boston area. They wanted to have something for the ICU nursing staff to do early in the pandemic, where the mortality rates were really high. A lot of patients were dying from COVID. They were looking for something to do, and they were also finding that the nurses weren't able to be attending when they were offering like talking sessions or these sort of mindfulness groups. The nurses just weren't showing up. So we helped them adapt this program to the ICU at this hospital near Boston, that they could do this ritual. But what Rosemary recently told me they're finding is that in other places in her institution at UCSF, they've been using elements of this, and that there is, what they're noticing, this cultural shift toward the inclusion of statements about stopping to recognize and honor difficult feelings, for example. That's part of the ritual, is let's pause and recognize and honor that we're having like the experience of grief or sadness at the loss of a patient. So
Right.
Elements of it, which are essentially, a mindfulness: stop, recognize, this is sadness, this is grief. Like even the gesture. She said that they do this gesture when a patient dies. They write the name of the patient and they place it on an altar. And the form is, they pause, they place their hand on their chest, they pause, they take a breath, they recognize whatever it is they're feeling, they place the name on the altar. Even that gesture, the hand on the chest, that's like evoking a parasympathetic response, a compassion. It's a self-compassion gesture. Like, it's remarkable, right? These are small things that have an impact, and that can also, when incorporated across an institution over time, can begin to shift the way people begin to allow that. So stopping, pausing, recognizing is and can be included. We can also include that all these patients dying has an impact on us. We can include that we are enormously affected by this.
Yes, that nurture. It's like the RAIN acronym, from Tara.
Yes. Recognize, allow, yes. Yeah, exactly.
It is practice, and that acknowledgement of feelings is, in the 4 foundations of mindfulness. This mindfulness
Right.
of feelings,
Right.
and just noticing what's going on in the body right now.
Right. Right.
The body,
And then they do it together. So the once a month, they do that together. So there's that relational element. They get together as a group, and they do this recognizing together as a group, and they acknowledge to one another as a group, we are feeling this, we are acknowledging this. And then they sing together at the end, which is like fantastic.
Nurture. I mean, that's nurturing. It really is.
Yeah.
Eyes, getting curious about it. Like, what is this? And that curiosity part just kind of opens it up. Like, whenever we could inject curiosity in, it makes a lot of space for the feeling that's difficult. So it's really beautiful. By what, this embodiment, we talked a lot about. I'd like to circle back to that, because we talked a lot about trauma, um, when we're struggling emotionally, when we're struggling, when that shifts or changes into something that's more intense, or if you're dealing with a mental illness or a significant challenge emotionally, what does it mean? How could you define how how that affects the body specifically? What does that mean? How would you describe that?
How all of those things affect our bodies?
Trauma,
Yeah.
emotional challenges, mental health challenges.
Yeah.
I think tend to think of, um, the brain almost like the neck up versus the neck down, right? We hear that a lot.
Yes. Yes. That's been an unfortunate polarization um, that's existed for a while, which is again why I love Dan Siegel's definition of the mind so much, is that it starts with, it is embodied, that our mind is embodied, and that we do not and cannot separate. And we have so much of our emotional experience happens in the body. We only have to stop and pay attention briefly to notice we experience most of our emotions in the body, fear, happiness, anything. If we reflect for a moment, we feel in the body. And there's been so much just remarkable and interesting research in the last couple of decades about how much benefit there is to working in um, modalities that utilize the body in helping move through difficult emotional experiences and psychological experiences. So they manifest in all kinds of ways, even in psychosomatic illness, which has been known for many, many, many years. So, it can manifest in really any way. But I think what's exciting is that there's just more and more um, understood and described through research about this, and then more and more therapies that are now developed, like really developed, and can articulate what's happening and why they work. So, for instance, like psychomotor therapy and somatic experiencing therapy, lots of studies now being done with yoga and Tai Chi about how can these be applied and what can be useful about them. But um, yeah, but when we can understand that our mind is embodied, then it only makes sense, of course, that we cannot separate out emotional difficulty from our bodies. And most of us know this directly, experientially, right? We do. Um, but I think there's also this cultural disconnect that we live with, right? We do live with this cultural disconnect. So on some level, we can't separate our minds and our bodies, but we also, many of us lived and grew up in this culture where somehow we think we can.
Right. Or we just want to take that magic pill, right? And sometimes
Yeah.
I just want to say, sometimes we really need the medication too. And that's where we
Yes.
really came together and said,
Yes.
there's all this opening here to alternative modalities and body work and yoga and Tai Chi and, these healing modalities. We talked about rain and therapeutics and psychotherapy. But at the end of the day, it's
Yes.
suffering.
Yes.
We can't turn away,
Yes.
right? The Western medicine.
Yes. There's simply not an either or,
Right.
right? When we were talking earlier about a non-limiting view and not an either or view, there's simply not, it doesn't have to be this or that there are many different ways of approaching healing. And I think when we were talking Tuesday, we were talking about the path to relieving suffering often includes medication can relieve symptoms. Medication can be life-saving for some people. and then allow more work to be done. So yes, it's simply not either or. Not at all.
Great.
Not at all. No, not at all.
Well, I
Um,
want to be mindful of our time together today
mm,
because we
hmm
have some great questions coming in from our group. So, if it's okay with you, I wanted to open this up for our audience
mm.
today, and just get to some of these questions if you're ready for that.
Yes, that sounds
Okay,
good.
awesome, awesome. So, from Dr. Christine Keisinger said that Dr. Vivek Murphy's study on loneliness,
Mm,
especially workplace loneliness, is stunning and alarming. Can you talk
yes.
about the importance of social support and staying well right now when we are urged to distance?
Yes. So Dr. Murthy's work on loneliness is really revolutionary. I remember hearing him speak a few years ago at a conference on physician well-being. And he had said that when he became Surgeon General under Obama, he went around the country talking to physicians and also just to the general public. And he wanted to know what were people's main health concerns. And he said, I fully expected to hear we have, these disease concerns and those. And he said that he was stunned to learn that the major threat to our health in this country is loneliness.
Yeah.
And I was also really stunned to hear him say that. This was only 3 years ago. And that has only increased, certainly since the onset of the pandemic. So, social supports are vitally important for us. They're not just nice to have, they're literally life sustaining. We are we need our social support. So in the face of any difficulty, in the face of any stressor,
Mhm.
mobilizing social supports is of critical importance. And so absolutely one of the central challenges of this pandemic is that one of the one of the ways of managing it is to keep physically distant from people. And we're seeing how hard that is for people. We are seeing how challenging that is and the toll that that's taking. So always the questions are, how do you assess the risks and the benefits? How do you assess that? How do you assess, how do I balance my need for connection with the risks, and how do I find connection in the safest ways possible? How do I find as good and strong connections as I can in ways that keep myself and others safe, rather than taking the all or none approach to, well, I need my social connection, so I'm just going to do whatever, right? So can we, I mean, in a sense, it's, can we be thoughtful at every step on how can we both maintain awareness of our responsibility to ourselves and others, and have the social connection that we need. And there's no easy answer, and it's not the answer isn't the same for me, you know, uh, who lives with the family at home as it is for someone who lives alone. Like, the answer isn't the same for each person, but it is one of the, I think, most devastating aspects of this pandemic is the loneliness that many people are experiencing, and it's crushing for some people. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, it is. Do you think that, we are today, right now, together? There's 30 plus people here. Is Zoom enough to meet this moment? How does Zoom help? Like, is it helping? Um, are there, any studies on this? Do you think we'll find
I don't.
out?
I
Something.
think we'll be learning a lot about it. I think it meets some needs, but clearly not all of them.
Right.
It meets some needs, but clearly not all of them. Um, and I think every person's different. It clearly doesn't meet the need for touch, for human touch. For
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
There's another question here from Jamie Winnick, and Jamie asks,
Hi, Jamie.
um, can you say more about resilience building practices?
Yes. Yes. So resilience is those are practices that help us to be more flexible and adaptive to meet circumstances that are challenging and maintain our flexibility and adaptability to help keep ourselves in receptive mind states instead of reactive mind states. And those are those are varied practices, and we could think of them in different dimensions. So there are um, breathing practices, right? Mindfulness practices build resilience, and they do that in different ways. But so breathing practices, which could include mindfulness, but also like resonance breathing practices. Um, there's physiologic resilience. Exercise helps us build physiologic resilience. Getting enough sleep helps us build and maintain physiologic resilience. Good nutrition helps us maintain physiologic resilience. There's emotional resilience. Mindfulness practices help us with that. Maintaining good relationships, attending to friendships, attending to interpersonal relationships helps us with emotional resilience. Um, so resilience is broadly that which helps us to maintain our flexibility and adaptability in the face of challenges. And so there are many, many different practices. But if we want to think about, like, for healthcare professionals on the job, those are mindfulness practices, um, breathing practices potentially, and then some others that are described in the literature, a practice called 3 good things, which is essentially a gratitude practice, but it's actually studied, and it helps people focus on positive things that they can be grateful for, that they have some influence over. So that's one described in the literature specifically for healthcare professionals on the job. Breathing practices, 3 good things, and then something like, for instance, the honor project, to be more specific. Yeah.
Yeah. Lots of methods and techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Is something for everyone, really, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, well, we have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to see if there are any other questions from the group. You could chat them in, of course, or you could just turn your microphone on if you'd like to ask the question directly to Dr. O'Neill. Siobhan, is there anything that we didn't cover that you feel is critically important?
Oh, Leslie has a question. Hi,
Okay, there.
Leslie.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi. Hi. Thank you, Siobhan. I think Sarah just also asked a good questions about um, parenting, and also, I guess, just tag along to Sarah's comment. What are some of the simple ways we can introduce mindfulness on everyday basis? Very simple ways. And also, you don't have to answer this question since we only have 5 minutes, but I'm wondering, you know how America, we were so behind on maternity leave, and what are some of the policy or support that can be placed at workplaces, looking 20, 30 years from now?
You mean for like resilience, Leslie, workplace policies that help with resilience or mindfulness, or?
Like relating to mental support, like
Uh-huh.
loneliness and mindfulness and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So simple practices in the home. So Leslie, you've been in our home before. Like, one of the simple things we do is the practice of ringing a bell before meals. That's an easy one to begin with and introduce, especially with kids. And our kids are used to that one. It's a practice of listening to 3 sounds of a bell before meals and practicing silence while we do that. That's a nice one because it's simple, it doesn't take a lot of time, and it becomes a ritual. So that's a nice one. And then other things like practicing gratitude. We also do that one after listening to Three Sounds of a Bell. We practice gratitude and say, what are we each grateful for that day? That does a few things. It's a practice of bringing to mind what we can be grateful for. It's a practice in positive thinking, that focusing on what's positive, it engenders positive feeling, and that has a good effect on all of us. So that's another practice, and that's a good one to do with kids as well. In terms of policies in workplace, I mean, that's a big question, but I think many workplaces, Jen, you might have a good question about this since you work with a lot of corporations, but one thing that, in fact, I'm interested in what you have to say about this, Jen, but workplaces in general should be very interested in this, because what is clear is that when workers are well and are experiencing well-being, they work better, that everything goes better. So we would think that everyone would have a very vested interest in a well work population. But so I'm very interested in what you have to say about this, Jen. This is your area of expertise.
Yeah, we have learned a lot over the last few years. And we know that it's interesting because we go into a lot of organizations, and while you might expect that they're particularly interested in increased productivity or improved focus or concentration or improved relational capacities, really what we've found and experienced is that they just really want their people to be supported, that they recognize that employee care is essential, and they are particularly worried about how people are coping right now, especially this year. Previous to COVID impacting us in March, the conversation really revolved around burnout. And we talked a lot about stress-related, chronic-related stress, chronic stress, and how that related to burnout, and how impactful it was to people. So it's important to know that executives, human resources professionals are really on top of this, and they're trying to figure it out. So I think that's why solutions like ours have become more of a priority, and it's essential to integrate the programming into things that are already working and enhance those programs with tools, and then also expand those programs by offering connection to experts in the field, so that people have access to practices, so that they can have access to daily practices in community together, and really feel motivated by those opportunities. So we're still figuring it out. We don't have everything figured out, of course, but I think that the science has helped us get to where we are today. And of course, there's conscious leaders out there that are proving and really pushing us forward in significant ways, because we know this works. We know these practices work. So I hope that helped. I know that we're right at 3:00, and I can't believe an hour's gone by. I am going to say I definitely am going to ask you to come back again, Siobhan, because I've enjoyed our time together so very much. Is there anything you would like to promote? We'll of course be posting the recording of our conversation today on our blog, and we'll share that. And of course, we'll share anything that you cited, as well as the projects that you cited and some of the resources that we talked about. But is there anything else you'd like to add?
I just want to thank you again, Jen, for hosting the conversation, and to say thank you to all of my friends who came to support me and to be in this conversation with me today. It's so nice to see all of your faces. Thank you. It's nice to see you all.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.